Good morning, guys. We are going to start our Chapter 8 vocabulary this morning. We're looking at a few vocab terms in terms of therapeutic services. The first one being body mechanics. Body mechanics are the ways in which we position our bodies to put us in a better position so we don't get injured. When we are lifting a lot, we hear mostly about body mechanics in that we don't bend our back. We keep our back straight. We lift from our legs. We have a good wide base. All of those things are body mechanics. The actual definition for body mechanics is specific positions for muscles and joints that help a person avoid injury during a physical task. So as for the example of weightlifting, we have a good wide base with our feet. We use our legs because we have the large muscle groups in our legs rather than putting all that strain on our back. Another example of body mechanics would be the positioning of secretaries or people that are at a desk all day. They're not going to have their keyboards in a bad position where their wrist is in a position of strain where they might cause carpal tunnel for being in that position all day. The second one is informed consent. The actual definition of informed consent is a patient's choice to accept or reject a procedure after receiving information on available options and possible consequences. So for every single procedure, test, surgery, anything that occurs within a healthcare facility, the patient has to give informed consent. They have to be fully aware of what's going to happen in that procedure. That has to be outlined by the healthcare professional. They also need to be made aware of other options for other testing, maybe outline an MRI versus a CT scan and why the MRI is a better choice in this particular setting or looking for this particular injury or illness. Another part of informed consent is to let the patient know the consequences of not having that procedure or that test or that surgery done. So in the case of maybe a knee replacement, you would explain to the patient that if you continue to do injections and physical therapy, that might relieve some of the pain, but it's ultimately not going to take care of the end range arthritis. That the only really real solution for fixing the actual arthritis is a knee replacement. So these things need to be explained, like I said, before every procedure, test, surgery, anything that's done at the hospital. And then the patient has to agree and say, yes, I want to go ahead and do that. The only loophole to that is if the patient is unable to speak for themselves, like in a case where they are unconscious. When they're unconscious, then the informed consent is implied. We take it for granted that they would want our help in that instance. Another time when we talk about informed consent often is when someone is trying to determine whether they would do CPR or they would do like a Heimlich maneuver. That is important to ask someone before you start the Heimlich maneuver. If you see someone choking in a restaurant, you're not going to go up and wrap your arms around them and begin the Heimlich maneuver without asking for their consent. You might say, "Are you choking?" and they will nod or shake their head. And then you can ask them if they would be willing to have your help or can I help you? Most of the time they will nod, and then that serves as that informed consent. The third one is malpractice. Malpractice literally means bad practice. So as you can imagine, it's used for those times when a healthcare provider doesn't do exactly what they should or maybe does something incorrectly and it causes harm to a patient. Terms for actions that violate a professional's scope of practice or standard of care and result in injury to a patient that could reasonably have expected. So if you do CPR on a patient and you do not do the chest compressions, okay, and that person dies in the process, that is an example potentially of malpractice because that is something that's within that scope, something that is expected to occur with anyone that has that CPR training. Mandatory reporting. As you can expect, it is the responsibility to report certain events. In education, we have to, and as well as healthcare, we have to report anytime there is suspected abuse of a minor, abuse of any kind, whether it be physical, emotional, sexual. That is a mandatory report. There are other times that, as looking at the way things are in the world today, anytime someone has a positive COVID test, that has to be reported to the State Department of Health. Not necessarily the patient's name has to be shared in public, but the fact that they had a positive test or that we had a positive test in Jasper County needs to be reported so that the public can be notified of this new case. Legal requirement for certain health issues to be reported by authorities. Like I said, the biggest one that most people talk about, or the biggest case that it applies for healthcare workers and educate people in education, is the abuse. And so, if we're suspecting that any student is being abused, then that has to be reported. Just like in the case of if we have a student come in with some really contagious disease, that has to be reported. There's a list of illnesses and diseases that have to be reported to the State Department of Health because they are a harm to the general public. Medical errors. Medical errors are those preventable mistakes that can occur at any point in healthcare and potentially cause harm to the patient. So not necessarily all intentional, hopefully not intentional. If you're in healthcare for the right reasons, we do not want to make medical errors, but sometimes errors happen. We're human just like anyone else, and those errors have to be reported so they can take the necessary steps to reduce the harm as much as possible to the patient. Organizational chart. Okay, organizational chart is a diagram that shows how departments in an organization are related to one another. So if we look at the organizational chart for the high school, at the very top of that organizational chart would be our school board. Okay, below that would be Mr. Craig, and then below Mr. Craig would branch out into the 4 schools. So we would have Mrs. Norris, Mr. Wynn, Mr. Michael, and then Mr. Jones. And each of those are on the same level of the organizational chart. So they're all responsible for their own buildings. They work together for the good of the corporation, but then also their ultimate concern is their own building. So each of those people would report to Mr. Craig, who would then report to the school board. In the case of a healthcare facility, there's many, many branches, usually starting with the CEO and then down to department managers and then to supervisors and then leads. So like in the sports medicine branch that I'm a part of, we have the lead physical therapist, the lead occupational therapist, the lead athletic trainer, and then all of the staff members are below that. Safety check. The process of looking for and removing potential hazards that could cause injury or harm. I think that a lot of times we do this without even um, necessarily saying what we're doing or realizing what we're doing. Okay. But when you think about different sports, um, we look for hazards before every game. If there's water on the floor, we dry that water up and notify someone to make sure that there's not a leak from the ceiling or something like that that could cause someone to slip and fall. We also look at safety equipment. Okay. We make sure that there is padding under the baskets against the wall so that if someone in a basketball game is running off the baseline and they run into the wall, that they're going to hit that mat or that padding before they hit the brick wall. We look at football helmets each week to make sure that all of the pieces are tight, nothing is broken, nothing is missing, to decrease that injury. The same thing happens in healthcare. Before you use a electrical machine, you check to make sure the wires aren't frayed. You check to make sure that everything's in working order. You check to make sure that nothing has gotten wet. All of those things are safety checks. Safety precautions. Information about the safe operation of a piece of equipment, which is usually found in the instruction manual or on equipment tables. So it's kind of those warnings or those reminders about how to use a product safely. It goes without saying that electrical equipment should not be used in water, and it needs to be used with the supervision of an adult. Those are some safety precautions that you might find in a manual for some electrical equipment. Scope of practice. Scope of practice varies from healthcare provider to healthcare provider.